Hello everyone, I am Nat1995 here in the video game fanfic plot. Sorry if you guys could hear my little brother yelling in the background. He doesn't know how to be quiet while I'm recording. And just a brief note, 63% of you guys have not subscribed to the YouTube channel. If you can, please subscribe to the YouTube channel and help me reach 400 subscribers. That would be very appreciated. And now, on to the episodes.
Chapter 43. An exclusive evening. You should have seen it, Bushy. It was wonderful. The minions showed me all the jokes and pranks that were laying all around the joke shop. I told Speaker we needed to get some so that we can prank dumbly. I would like to see it, Nora, so can you hold off until I'm better? Hermione asked as she gave Nora a smile. Of course. But first I have to bite the trolls that did this to you. Also, you should know that I have already spoken to the peacock, and he said it would be a good idea to feed them to the sushi. Nora said, as she flicked her tongue in a mischievous manner. Hermione giggled a bit and patted Nora's head. Thank you, Nora. You're very welcome, Bushy, she replied as she curled up next to Hermione's pillow. But I think I should stay here in case they come back. But come and get me before dinner, Speaker, she added, looking at Salazar who was sitting by Hermione's hospital bed. I will, my dear, Salazar replied with a grin. I'm just surprised that you are willing to miss breakfast. Nora hissed loudly and decided to ignore him, but Hermione laughed softly. It was before breakfast the day after the Hogsmeade visit, and Hermione was still in a weakened state due to being cursed by Pansy, Millicent, and Hestia Caro, whose twin sister was Flora. Poppy had removed all the various curses, but said that Hermione still needed to rest and then she would be released in a day or two. Minerva nearly threw a fit when she learned what happened to Hermione, and demanded Albus do something about it. He did, but it was hardly enough. He pulled all the girls into his office and gave them a stern talking to, took a few points from Slytherin, then let them go with a warning. No detention, no letter home, no loss of Hogsmeade privileges, and he didn't even make them apologize to Hermione. Everyone was livid, but there was nothing that Minerva or Remus could do, especially since Albus forbade them from doing anything. Salazar and Godric had decided to take matters into their own hands, though they didn't exactly know what they were going to do yet. So Hermione, Blaise asked with a grin. Tell us how the wonderful Victor Crumb asked you to the ball. Hermione giggled and blushed, but she gave everyone a large smile. Well, he admitted to waiting until you guys went around because he was shy about asking me. I had seen him in the library a lot and he was always smiling at me, and I would always smile back. When Victor asked me in Honeydukes, he said he thought I was nice because I was the only girl not throwing myself at him and he admired me for that. He asked if anyone had asked me to the ball yet, and I told him no. He looked shocked and admitted that he figured one of you had, but I told him no, and he asked me just like that. She exclaimed. He's really a shy person, which surprised me because of being famous for Quidditch and now the tournament, but he seems really nice. I'm happy for you, Hermione, Salazar said with a grin. I really am, and I think you going with him is a wonderful thing. He did ask me if you would be angry because you're one of my good friends, and a champion, but I assured him you wouldn't be. She replied. I'll let him know that myself so that he doesn't worry, but I'll warn him to watch where he puts his hands, Salazar said with a grin, which caused Hermione to blush a deep red and smack him on the arm. Don't you dare threaten him, she cried, causing everyone to laugh. He won't, Godric said with a grin. He's all talk, haven't you all figured that out by now? But I have news too, I'm going to the ball as well. With who? Salazar asked curiously. I'm not telling. You'll have to wait and see, Godric said with a chuckle. Uh-oh. Neville chuckled. Something tells me this ought to be good. What about you, Harry? Salazar sighed and shook his head. Still no idea. Well, you need to get a move on, Mr. Potter, Poppy said as she walked over with a breakfast tray. but you all must go so that Miss Granger can eat in peace, then rest. You all can visit later." "Yes, Mom," Salazar said with an over-exaggerated sigh as he rolled his eyes, but he grinned at the Medi witch who huffed in annoyance. "Wait, before you go," Hermione said, propping herself up with her pillows as Poppy set the tray down. "Did Professor Lupin show you that thing with the Patronus?" "Yes, he did actually," Godric replied. "During the First War, Albus invented a way to make a Patronus talk so that they could deliver messages to each other safely. Remus showed us how to do that last night. It's ingenious really, and I have to admit it, Albus was pretty smart to come up with something like that." "I agree," Salazar said with a nod. "Godric and I have decided that you all need to be taught the Patronus charm, and we will also show you how to make them talk. It's really advanced magic though, and most adult witches and wizards can't do it, but we will work with you. It's going to be tough, so make sure you're ready." "We will," the children chorused. "We will start after Hermione is deemed to be all right by you," Salazar chuckled after noticing Poppy's glare. "And not a minute before. Now shoo, so she can eat in peace," Poppy said, waving them towards the doors. Everyone laughed, but said goodbye to Hermione as they all headed to the Great Hall for breakfast. Albus Dumbledore speaks out about Harry Potter's accusations. In a shocking letter sent to us from Albus Dumbledore, we at the Daily Prophet felt it was our duty to publish this letter in its original form. This letter has not been altered in any way, and was penned by Albus Dumbledore himself. We at the Daily Prophet are not liable for its contents. Dear Wizarding World, it is with a heavy heart and mind that I have decided to address the issues that Harry Potter has so publicly aired, but I must ask you all to read through this letter so that you better understand the situation. While some of what Mr. Potter has said is true, the facts have been greatly exaggerated, and because of that, I have barred Mrs. Skeeter from coming onto school property and conducting personal interviews. However, she is still welcome for True Wizard events only. It is true that I have made grave mistakes where Harry Potter is concerned. It is true that I placed him with his abusive mole relatives, but contrary to what Mrs. Skeeter wrote in her article, I did not know they were abusive at the time, and for that I am humbly sorry. It is true that I tried to obliviate Mr. Potter, but I assure each and every one of you, I have never tried to obliviate any of your children. I had a good reason for my actions against Mr. Potter, reasons that, due to his young age, Mr. Potter doesn't understand and deems controlling. I was trying to protect him from being influenced by a very dangerous and dark wizard. There are very few people in this world that I don't trust, but one man in particular is someone whom we all should be wary of. His name is Nilrem. And while I know many of you will realize that name is Merlin spelled backwards, he is not anything like the great Merlin himself. He is a dark and dangerous wizard, and certainly not the best person to be influencing young Mr. Potter's mind. Especially since Mr. Potter has aspirations of becoming a dark wizard himself. Let me explain. In her article, Mrs. Skeeter referred to Mr. Potter's agenda. That agenda is quite true. Mr. Potter does indeed want to permanently rid the world of Lord Voldemort, but he also wants to take his place as the next Dark Lord. Harry Potter is a dark wizard, and it is my fear that if Mr. Potter is left to be influenced by a man like Nilrem, he will become much worse than Lord Voldemort himself ever was. There are already many similarities between Lord Voldemort and Harry Potter that are very disturbing, that makes me draw this conclusion. For example, both are half-blooded, though this in itself is not bad. Both were raised by moles. Again, not a bad. Both hate moles. Both are parcel mouths. Both are Slytherins. Both own pet snakes. Both practice very dark magic. I myself have witnessed Mr. Potter use blood magic on several occasions and know of him using extremely dark hexes and jinxes, though none have been unforgivables. So far. Both have eschewed views on what constitutes as light magic and dark magic. They're cousins. Through the ancient Peveril family line. Both have friends that they use for their own gain. Lord Voldemort's school friends ended up being the first Death Eaters, though I am uncertain if Mr. Potter will adopt a similar moniker. Both rebuke authority, and never follow the rules. Both wanted to be professors and teach at Hogwarts. Though I can assure you, this will never happen. These are just some of the examples of the similarities that they share, and I'm sure that as Mr. Potter ages, there will be more that they have in common. Mrs. Skeeter called Mr. Potter a delightful and polite young man, with handsome looks and a charming smile, but what you all fail to realize is so was Tom Riddle, also known as Lord Voldemort. Tom Riddle was a boy just like Harry Potter, but I saw through him and he hated me for it, just as Harry Potter currently hates me. Tom Riddle began attending Hogwarts in 1938 and graduated at the top of his class in 1945. I knew then that Tom Riddle was not the boy he made himself out to be, and I tried to warn everyone, but no one listened to me and well. You all know what happened after that. It is my great fear that no one will listen to me again. I am afraid that you all will not be able to see past the boy who lived and will not see him for what he really is. An aspiring Dark Lord. Please, I beg you all, do not be fooled by his charming smile and demeanor. Do not be fooled by the fact that he has several Melbourne friends and is friends with many Gryffindors. He uses them, just as Tom Riddle used his so-called friends. Do not be fooled by Harry Potter. Your lives depend on it. Sincerely, Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore, Headmaster of Hogwarts, Chief Warlock, Grand Sorcerer, Supreme Mugwump, Order of Merlin, First Class. Salazar stared at the Daily Prophet and couldn't decide if he wanted to laugh or blow up the Great Hall. All around him students and staff were whispering and giving him fearful looks, and even the Slytherins, including Draco and company, were slowly edging away from him in fear. It reads like a disjointed train of thought, Godric muttered as he began to reread the letter. It's like he couldn't decide on one topic and just kept jumping around. It's definitely safe to say that Dumbledore isn't a writer, Blaise muttered. It's because he's senile, Salazar said as he rolled his eyes. Then he looked around the Great Hall. People were beginning to point at him now, and Albus looked smug as he sat in his chair at the head table. Severus was scowling, but that could be interpreted many ways. Minerva looked ready to kill someone, and Remus was shaking so badly with anger that the edition of the paper he was holding was rustling loudly. Salazar knew he needed to diffuse the tension in the room, before someone did something horrible to the idiot headmaster. So he decided to do the only thing he could do. He stood up in his seat and loudly cleared his throat. The entire Great Hall hushed, and many whimpered loudly and cringed in fear. Fred, George. He snapped loudly, causing the twins to furrow their brows in confusion. As my friends, I demand that I use you for my own entertainment. He shouted angrily as he stomped his foot. Now, get up out of your seats this minute, and jump around and cluck like chickens. Do this, or suffer my wrath. Godric and Blaise snorted and nearly choked on their bite of breakfast, while Neville, who was sitting with them at the Slytherin table, burst out laughing. Fred and George grinned, and a few moments of chaotic clucking ensued as Salazar stood on his seat with an exaggerated angry look on his face. Enough! Salazar cried abruptly. Thank you, servants. Now shut up and sit down. Yes, O great and powerful Dark Master. We will obey, we will obey. They cried in unison. Can I shine your shoes, O Great One? Fred called out loudly. Shall I feed you myself? George asked. Yes, you mustn't let your wand arm get tired. Your hands are so pretty and you might accidentally bite yourself, if your arm does get tired. If it does, we can do your homework for you, O Great Dark Master. For 5 galleons an savo. 2 galleons for standard homework. This is not a joke. Albus bellowed, as he jumped out of his seat so fast that he knocked it over. Despite Albus's letter, nearly everyone in the Great Hall was giggling, but it all ceased immediately as the enraged headmaster's face turned purple. "This is not a joke," he repeated a bit more calmly, but Godric snorted loudly, which sent Neville into a fit of laughter, while Blaise tried to hide a snicker. Albus glared at Godric and Salazar, but then he turned his gaze on Neville. "Mr. Longbottom, I am very surprised at you. I know you are Harry's friend, but you have to see that he is using you. After what the Death Eaters did to your parents." "Albus!" Minerva cried loudly, as Neville glared at him and started shaking with anger. "Don't you dare!" Neville growled as he tightened his grip on his wand. "Don't you dare try and use my parents like that. They were good people, and it's because of you that they are in the condition that they are in. You want to save the Death Eaters. You want to change them and bring them over to the light side. You're an idiot. They won't change. They will never change, and they teach their children the same crap that they believe. Hermione is laying in a hospital bed because you are too much of a coward to stand up to Death Eater scum," he bellowed. "Good people are getting hurt, while you plead for the very bigots who hate you. You're an idiot," he repeated as he shook with uncontrolled anger. But Neville wasn't finished. "And as for Harry, this whole thing is rubbish," he shouted, throwing down the paper and stomping on it. "You don't know a damn thing about Harry. You sit up there with your judgmental, arrogant, pompous, self-righteous attitude and look down on people who think differently than you. You are nothing but a manipulative bastard, and you sacrifice good people for the greater good. Harry is no more a dark wizard than I am, and as for Mr. Nilrem, well, I can't wait for the day he knocks you flat on your ass. You stay away from me, Dumbledore, because if you don't, you'll be sorry. I promise you that. And you can tell my grandmother exactly what I have said here today, but I can tell you, she won't be mad at me," he shouted. Then he whirled around, stomped over to Malfoy, grabbed him by the hair, hauled him to his feet, and shoved him into the wall. "You stay away from us, Malfoy. I'm not scared of you because you are just a little snot. You are not a man, you are a sniveling little coward who will be dealt with soon enough," he growled, before punching Draco in the face, knocking him out, and causing his nose to bleed. Then he rounded on Pansy. "As for you, Parkinson, you're lucky you're a girl. You're lucky I was raised to not hit a female, but if you so much as look at Hermione wrong again, you will be dealing with me. Is that clear?" he asked, getting in her face and causing her to fall out of her seat and whimper in fright. But Neville still wasn't finished. He rounded on a completely ashen-faced Albus, and looked him directly in the eye. "You may have pointed out a bunch of stupid things that Harry has in common with Voldemort. Yeah, I said his name," he said, looking around as nearly everyone in the Great Hall flinched. "But there is one glaring difference between the two of them. You are the only wizard Voldemort is afraid of, but Harry isn't afraid of you. Voldemort himself will tremble in fear once Harry gets a hold of him, so Headmaster, you keep that in mind when Harry has you thrown out of this school on your ass, because you will also be sorry that you have crossed him." And with that, Neville stormed out of the Great Hall, leaving it in shocked state of silence. Salazar and Godric sighed deeply as they looked at Albus. "Well, he's not wrong about any of it," Salazar said, as he, Godric, and Blaise walked out to find Neville, with the twins hurrying after them. They searched for nearly an hour to find Neville, and they finally found him in the astronomy tower, sitting down against the wall, and looking out over the grounds. The cold wind was howling fiercely and all of them shivered against it, but Neville seemed to not be bothered by it as he ignored their approach. It wasn't until they all sat down next to him that Neville spoke. "I'm sorry for my outburst," he said quietly as he continued to stare out over the grounds. "And I'm sorry for what I said about you not being afraid of him." Salazar patted the young man on his knee and smiled. "It's all right. You were right about everything you said, and there's no point in pretending otherwise. I hate him. I wanted so badly to kill him for trying to make me feel guilty about being your friend by using my parents' condition. I just thought I wanted to kill him. I knew at that moment that I could cast the killing curse and end his life. I just knew I could," he said, as tears spilled down his cheeks. "Does that make me a bad person? Does that make me no better than a Death Eater?" he asked, finally looking at Salazar and Goldrick with a worried expression. "No, Neville, it makes you human. You had a right to be angry, and maybe it could have been handled differently, but you only shouted. You didn't hex him, you didn't jinx him, you didn't assault him, you only shouted," Goldrick answered as he gazed at the young man with concern. "You are nothing like a Death Eater, Neville, because a Death Eater would have killed him, but you didn't. That makes you better than them. Despite your anger and hatred, you were able to control yourself. A person should never kill anyone because they hate them." "I punched Draco," he said sheepishly. "That's because he's a git," Fred said, causing Neville to chuckle a bit, but then he sighed. "But we hate the Death Eaters, and you guys say we should kill them," he said. "What does that make us?" "There is a difference in killing someone in self-defense and killing someone simply because you don't like them," Goldrick gently explained. "We would not just walk up to Lucius Malfoy in Diagon Alley and strike him dead, but if he was dressed in Death Eater garb, engaged us in a fight, and was determined to kill us, then we would respond in kind." "So self-defense is what makes the difference?" he asked. "Correct," Salazar said softly. "The hatred you feel for Dumbledore is normal, especially because he used your parents' condition to try and make you feel guilty. But be careful with your anger and revenge," Goldrick warned, and then he sighed. "Do you remember back in second year when Albus said that revenge is a slippery slope that can lead you down a dark path?" he asked, and Neville nodded. "Well, I hate to say this, but he was right. You cannot let your hatred and revenge control you. Believe me, I know," he added, looking at Salazar sadly. "Righteous anger is perfectly normal and fine. On some levels, it's even healthy because you don't want to bottle that stuff up, but don't let it control and consume you." "I understand," Neville said, taking a deep breath, as he wiped the tears off his cheeks. "I feel a lot better now. Thank you," he said with a smile. "You're welcome," Salazar and Goldrick said together, as they helped him to stand up. "Uh-oh," Blaise suddenly said, pointing towards an owl heading their way with a howler in his beak. Salazar sighed, took the howler, and promptly set it on fire. He knew it was going to be the first of many more to come. "You had no right to do this, Albus. No right," Sirius yelled, as Remus tried his best to restrain him. "Harry is only a child. A child. You had no right. And what you said about Mr. Longbottom's parents were way out of line," a red-faced Minerva yelled. Everything in Albus's office shook violently because of the sheer power coming from the combined anger of Merlin, Nicholas, and Perenelle, plus Sirius, Remus, Minerva, and even Severus, who was standing in his favorite dark corner. Moody was standing behind Albus with his back against the wall, and even he felt like cursing the man. He had warned Albus not to send that letter to the paper, and he warned him to stop his vendetta against Salazar, but clearly the headmaster didn't listen. Yesterday, Moody had told him that Potter had just had a good time out with his friends and that he did all the normal things that everyone does on Hogsmeade trips. Up until Hermione was cursed, that is. Thankfully Albus had believed him. At the moment though, he was staring at Merlin, who was eyeing him carefully, which greatly unnerved him. However, Sirius turned into Padfoot, breaking free of the hold Remus had on him. He growled, snarled, and lunged for Albus's throat, but Merlin grabbed him by the scruff of the neck, just as Remus hit him with the Animagus reversal charm. He fell to the floor with a loud thump and glared at them as he scrambled to his feet. Then he glared at Albus. "The Potter name will forever be marred because of your stupidity," he shouted, going for Albus again, only to be stopped again as Merlin grabbed him around the waist. Sirius continued to shout and wouldn't stop struggling against Merlin, but a sudden red light engulfed him and he went limp in Merlin's arms. The ancient wizard sighed and carefully lowered the stunned man into a chair. "He can be mad at me later," he announced as Remus chuckled despite the situation. Then Merlin turned to Albus. "Mr. Dumbledore, give me one good reason why I shouldn't strike you dead because of your stupidity." "Because you can't. You'll go to prison, and your life will be over," Albus said, glaring at him. "Trivialities," Merlin said, waving his head dismissively. "You have single-handedly ruined a young man's life because of your know-it-all assumptions. Harry is not an aspiring Dark Lord, but he will become a professor here one day," Merlin said with a smile, causing Albus to glare at him. "He does love to teach after all." "You're a fool, Albus," Nicholas said, bristling with anger. "But this is not over." "No, it's not," Perenelle said in a haughty manner, as she looked down her nose at him. "One day, Albus," she said as she pointed her finger in his scowling face. "One day you will find yourself disgraced and without a job, titles, and money. Mark my words." "You know," Albus said, standing up abruptly, "that is the second time today I have been threatened in such a manner. And I doubt it will be the last, that is, until all is in place and our plan is launched," Merlin said with a smile. "Harry is young, and it is possible for him to bounce back from this if given enough time, but you, Mr. Dumbledore, well, let's just say, you put the final nail in your own coffin." "And do tell me what plan you have," Albus snarled. "You have no idea what kind of power I hold." Nicholas laughed. "We are unconcerned about your power. Magical, political, or otherwise, and so is Harry. You don't seem to comprehend the situation here, Albus. Your little letter to the wizarding world will only be used against you in the future." "I'm done being talked to like a child," Albus shouted, pointing to the door. "Get out of my office, and get out of my school." "This is not your school, Mr. Dumbledore," Merlin said in a cold tone that made everyone shiver involuntarily. "It never has been your school, and it never will be your school. You are just a headmaster, though for how much longer is up for debate." "It certainly isn't yours," Albus said as he glared at Merlin. "Now get out," he growled. "No, it's not mine," Merlin said with a devious chuckle. "This school belongs to the founders, so do think on that, Mr. Dumbledore." Nicholas levitated Sirius, and with polite nods to Moody, Remus, and Minerva, they quickly left. Minerva then turned her furious gaze on Albus. "And I will be writing to Augusta Longbottom to tell her exactly how you tried to manipulate her grandson by using his parents, her son and daughter-in-law's condition to prove your petty point," she shouted. "Minerva," Albus said, glaring at her, "I have had enough of your insubordination. You're fired. Get out of this school and my office." Remus bristled, but Minerva smiled. "As you wish, Albus. I'll enjoy the extra long holiday, seeing as I'm sure I'll be back when Mr. Potter throws you out. Just so you know, you'll have to find yourself a new deputy head of Gryffindor, and Transfiguration Professor. I'm taking Pomona and Phileas with me too. That leaves you stuck finding heads for Ravenclaw and Hufflepuff, as well as new professors in charms and herbology," she said, turning on her heel and storming out. "And a new defense professor." "Goodbye, Albus," Remus said promptly, and followed her out. "Headmaster," Severus drawled. "If I may, perhaps you should rethink that decision. After all, we are vulnerable at the moment," he said, motioning towards his left forearm. Albus paled drastically as Severus's words sank in, and he quickly realized the predicament he had just placed them all in. Then he jumped out of his chair and ran after them. "Well played, Snape," Moody said gruffly. Severus sneered at him and walked out without a word, but Moody just chuckled and shook his head. He didn't know if all of this was a natural reaction, or if they had planned it. He did know one thing for certain though: Albus had no idea who he was up against. "It has been an incredibly long day," Salazar said as he flopped down in his favorite chair in the snake pit. He had been warding off howlers all day long, though he did find the one from Molly to Albus pretty funny. However, he was already getting tired of people nearly running away from him in fright. The only thing that made him laugh was when Severus told him what happened in Albus's office earlier that day, and what happened after Albus went running after Minerva and Remus. Apparently he pleaded for them to rethink their decisions to leave so quickly, and Minerva even managed to wiggle a pay raise out of him before she agreed to stay. Salazar was quite proud of her actually. They had also spent more time visiting Hermione in the hospital wing, and Salazar was pleased to find Grum sitting with her when they arrived. He had pulled the young man aside and told him that he was happy that Hermione would be attending the ball with him, seeing as she and Salazar had a more of a brother-slash-sister relationship. Grum had given him a wide smile after that, and they shook hands. Grum told Salazar that he would look after her, which pleased Salazar even more because he didn't even have to threaten the young man's life. He felt sure Hermione would be all right during the festivities that night. "Well, Harry," Blaise said as he sat down on the sofa and pulled out a book on advanced charms. "Look on the bright side, at least you won't have to hide from the females anymore." "It's too bad you don't have a date already though," Neville said, watching a few mermaids swim by the window. "Because now no one will want to go to the ball with you." Blaise chuckled. "But if you already had a date, you wouldn't anymore because no one would want to attend the Yule Ball with an aspiring Dark Lord," he said sarcastically. Salazar sighed and gazed at the golden egg that was still sitting on the table. "I was going to ask Susan Bones, but I don't think I will now. She would say no." "Tough luck too," Neville said, shaking his head. "Hannah told me earlier today that Susan doesn't have a date yet. Susan's a smart girl. She wouldn't say yes to me right now if I was the last person on Earth. It would cast a bad light on the Bones' name." "So what are you going to do?" Godric asked, as he continued to charm the rest of Luna's things so that they could get the stuff back to her. "I don't know, Godric," Salazar said, throwing his hands up in frustration. "Right now I'm torn on trying to create a spell that would allow me to turn Nora into a human for the evening, or just take a transfigured rock." "I would love to be your date speaker," Nora said as she laid on her rock in the corner. "But you must understand that I don't think I would make a very good dance partner, seeing as I have never had feet. However, I would like to wear a set of red robes. I do think they would look nice against my pretty black scales." Salazar chuckled. "My dear, if I could take you, I would." "Face it, Harry," Blaise said, not looking up from his book. "The only person who would say yes to you right now is someone like Rita Skeeter." He chuckled. Salazar stared at him owlishly. "What did you say?" "I said, Rita Skeeter is the only one who'd say yes to you right now," Blaise repeated. "Blaise, that's brilliant," Salazar cried, jumping up from his chair as a plan began to form in his mind. "But she's not allowed to come on school grounds," Godric said, looking up at him curiously. "And you're 14, and she's an adult." Albus said he barred her from doing personal interviews on school grounds, but she is still allowed to be here for True Wizard events. The Yule Ball is a True Wizard event. She'd love to gossip about who was wearing what, who went with whom, and see what other kinds of juicy things she could find out about people. Not to mention, it would annoy Albus, Salazar said as he grabbed a quill and a piece of parchment. "And I'm not 14. He added, glaring at Godric, who chuckled. He sat and stared at the parchment for a little while as conversation flowed around him, but then he grinned as he began to write. "My dear Rita, I know this letter may come as a shock, but I must ask you something very important. Will you be my date for the Yule Ball that will be held here at Hogwarts on Christmas Eve? I know that it is very short notice, and I will understand if you already have plans, but I think this could be very beneficial for both of us. You see, because of the headmaster's letter that was featured in the Daily Prophet, I am now unable to find anyone who is willing to be my date for the evening. As a champion, I am required to have one, seeing as all the champions have to open the ball with the traditional opening dance, as well as attend the traditional dinner. It is my understanding that all champions, their dates, and their head of schools will be seated together at the same table. I'm sure there will be some conversations that would pique your interest. Not to mention, I'm sure your readers would love to have inside gossip about who went with who, and what fashions the young Poulard ladies were wearing for the evening. I know that the headmaster barred you from conducting personal interviews on school property, but seeing as the U Ball is a true wizard event, there really isn't much he can do about it. I also happen to know that it is not against the rules for you to be my date, seeing as there is no age limit. I really do hope you consider my proposal, and I hope to hear from you soon. Sincerely yours, Harry James Potter. P.S. Do be sure to bring your lovely quill and notebook if you are able to come. I'm sure there is a charm out there that can render it invisible. Just be sure to watch out for Alastair Moody. Harry, you're balmy. Neville chuckled after Salazar finished reading it out loud. Salazar just gave him a wicked grin before tying the letter to Hedwig's leg. Please get this to her as fast as you can, and peck the eyeballs out of anyone who tries to stop you. He laughed as he scratched her head. She hooted loudly and nipped his fingers, but then she quickly took off down the entrance tunnel. Neville is right, Harry, you really are balmy, Blaise snorted. I can't believe that you actually asked Rita to be your date. Godric laughed. And I can't believe that you still haven't told me who you are going to the ball with, Salazar replied. Only the prettiest girl in school, Godric said with a mysterious wink, as Salazar glared at him. The rest of the night was spent doing various things. Godric finished charming all of Luna's stuff, and Salazar asked Dobby to return them to her. They hoped that the charms Godric put on them would deter anyone from stealing from Luna again, seeing as their skin would turn purple and the word thief would appear on their foreheads, but only time would tell if they learned. The next 2 weeks flew by for Salazar. The day after he sent the letter to Rita, he got an owl back saying that she would meet him in the entrance hall at 5 o'clock sharp, so that took a load off of Salazar's shoulders. He decided to warn Severus, Minerva, Remus, and Poppy, and he told the children to make sure they were polite and charmed and flattered Rita, because if they didn't, he was sure that Rita would not be kind to them. Rita's response wasn't the only thing that caused a stir among those in the know though. A few days after all of Luna's things had been returned to her, 3 of her dorm mates showed up at lunch with purple skin and hair with the word thief written across their foreheads. They hadn't been seen all day, but they came in with Poppy, who pulled Albus aside to explain the situation. Salazar and Godric just smirked and went about their business, but they did eventually tell Poppy that it would wear off in a week. She was furious with them, but once they told her what Helena had said, she lightened up a bit. Helena reported back to them and said that Professor Flitwick had called for meeting in Ravenclaw Tower. Apparently the head of Ravenclaw was furious, and punished the thieves appropriately, and warned that if anyone was caught bullying or stealing from another student that he would take the appropriate measures to see them out of Hogwarts for good. This greatly increased the respect the 2 founders had for Professor Flitwick. Neville, you have to help me, Ron cried desperately as he stared at his hideous robes in the mirror. I don't know what else to do. Ron, I don't know what to tell you, mate, Neville said, looking at the boy sympathetically. But there has to be something, Ron cried, as he tried to fight with frayed edges of the lace he had attempted to cut off. Neville glanced at his watch. Look, there is an hour and a half until dinner, so if we hurry, Harry or Gordy might be able to do something. No, I'll just suffer, Ron said with a dejected sigh. But would you want Susan Bones to suffer? Neville asked with a raised eyebrow. No. Ron exclaimed as a pained expression crossed his face. Do you think they would be willing to help? They would. Neville assured him, and he grabbed Ron by the arm and began dragging him from the dorm. They ran full speed down all the stairs and corridors, stopping only for a moment when Neville answered the Parseltongue question, "What is the proper incantation for the Patronus charm?" before heading into the snake pit. "Now I'm all sweaty," Ron grumbled when they entered, but then he looked around with wide eyes when they entered the main sitting area. Blimey, they did all this themselves? Well, they had help from some elves and decorating advice from a few people, but yeah, Neville said as he shrugged his shoulders. Harry? Gordy? Are you here? We have a problem. He called out. A muffled, "Hang on," came from Salazar's room, but he emerged a few moments later with wet hair and hastily thrown on pajama bottoms and a shirt. What's the matter? Salazar asked as he looked at the two curiously. Can you help Ron? Neville asked, motioning to the red-faced Weasley. Oh! Salazar exclaimed, as he realized the state in which Ron's robes were in. I can try, but come here and let me look at you. I'm not a professional seamstress, so nothing will be perfect, but I do have a few tricks up my sleeve. He chuckled. He studied the highly embarrassed young man for a moment, before he began to carefully vanish the frayed ends from where Ron tried to get rid of the lace. Then Salazar cast a freshening charm on the lad and his robes to get rid of the musty smell, which seemed to make Ron grin happily. Do you want a different color? Salazar asked, looking at Ron's smiling face. Yeah, I hate maroon, so can you just go with black? Ron asked hopefully. Salazar smiled, but did as the young man requested, and pretty soon he was finished. He had used a switching charm to temporarily switch the old-fashioned collar with a newer collar from one of his own spare dress robes, and used an invisibility charm on the cravat to give it a more modern appearance. When he was done, he pulled Ron into his room so that the young man could see the change, and Ron grinned happily. Harry, you are a lifesaver, Ron said. I know it's not perfect, but my robes look and smell loads better. Thank you. You're welcome. Salazar chuckled, as he gave the young man a smile. Just remember to bring it back so I can switch the collars back. Ron nodded. First thing tomorrow, Harry, and again, thank you. Neville grinned and checked his watch again. 45 minutes. We better get back up to Gryffindor Tower and finish getting ready. Thanks, Harry. Salazar laughed as the two ran back up the entrance tunnel, then he looked around and briefly wondered where Godric had gone, before darting back into his room to get himself ready. At 5 o'clock sharp, Salazar was standing in the entrance hall greeting a grinning Rita Skeeter. He had on dark emerald green dress robes with silver edges, and she was wearing silver dress robes with emerald green edges. He grinned at her when they caught sight of each other. Rita, you are looking very fetching this evening, he said with a grin as he bowed and kissed her hand, which caused her to giggle. And you as well, Mr. Potter. I am looking very forward to this evening, she said with a small laugh. Ah, Harry. A very familiar older voice said from a few feet away. I'm so glad to have caught up with you. Salazar turned around to find Godric, in his adult form, grinning at him. Listen, lad, I know what that letter in the paper said about you, but I want you to know that I have no problem with you and my son remaining friends. Well, thank you, Mr. Offen. Gordy and I were afraid you would disapprove, Salazar said, never missing a beat as he tried to keep from glaring at his best friend because of his idiocy. Bloody Gryffindor. He better not get recognized, Salazar thought, trying to keep his facial expression calm. Godric, who was wearing red and gold dress robes and had trimmed his red hair and beard, grinned at him. Not at all. In fact, it is my belief that the headmaster is a glory hound, to be honest. Oh really? Rita exclaimed with a shark-like grin. Do explain, mister. Please forgive me, Rita. This is my best friend Gordy's father. This is Gordon Ruffin. Mr. Ruffin, this is my lovely date this evening, Rita Skeeter. Ah. Miss Skeeter. Lovely to meet you, my dear. Gordruck said with a charming smile. I am a fan of your work, and to answer your question, it is my belief that Albus Dumbledore wishes to find dark wizards laying under every rock, just so people would look to him to vanquish them. First Grindelwald, then you know who, and now he is trying to make young Harry out to be a dark wizard to continue the trend. It seems he is trying to keep himself relevant. A very interesting statement, Mr. Ruffin. May I quote you on that? Of course, my dear. Gordruck said, giving her a wink, which caused her to grin widely. Just then, a hand appeared on Gordruck's arm and a smiling Poppy stopped to greet him and Rita. Salazar managed to refrain kicking Gordruck in the shins, but snorted when Gordruck began tripping over his words as he tried to compliment her. Poppy giggled and blushed, but Minerva began loudly ushering everyone, except the champions and their dates, into the Great Hall. Draco and Pansy, who passed by Rita and Salazar, made a side comment about him not having a real date, which made Rita quirk an eyebrow at him. That's Draco Malfoy, Salazar said, rolling his eyes. He thinks he is the best thing to walk the earth, but all he does is spout off about how great his father is. One would think Draco would try to make a name for himself instead of furthering his father's reputation. Indeed, Rita said with a nod as she studied Draco's date with distaste. And who is the girl he is with? Oh, that is Pansy Parkinson, Salazar whispered. I see, she said with a smirk. Harry, you look so dashing this evening, and Miss Skeeter, I'm so happy to finally meet you. An excited voice said from behind them. Salazar turned to find Hermione and Victor grinning at them, and Salazar returned her grin. Hermione, you look lovely this evening. Victor, you keep a watch on her, someone might try and steal her away, he said, causing Hermione to blush and Victor to laugh. You Harry? Rita asked as she laughed. Oh no, Hermione is another one of my good friends. She and I are more like brother and sister. He chuckled. Stealing her away from Victor would be awkward. Hermione laughed. Indeed. Salazar grinned. Who wants to go on a date with a brother figure? But as your friend, does it bother you that she is here with Mr. Crumb? Rita asked, raising an eyebrow. He is a fellow champion after all. Oh, not at all. In fact, I think it shows that we are more than just competitors in the tournament. The True Wizard Tournament, after all, is supposed to be about international magical cooperation. So it is, Rita said with a smile. I know my readers will love to know that there is nothing but friendship and respect among all the champions, though they probably would be more interested if there wasn't. Oh, there is a lot of conflict going on at Hogwarts this year, but it's not from the tournament. Cedric laughed, as a beautiful Cho Chang nodded politely at Rita. Is that so, Mr. Diggory? Rita asked, looking intrigued. Yes, between Harry and Professor Dumbledore. Which, by the way, Harry, I want you to know that I don't believe the rubbish he said about you in the paper. I don't see that from you. I know Dumbledore is a brilliant man, but something is not adding up. I don't know what it is, but there is something not right with him, Cedric said, shaking his head. He doesn't like me. Salazar laughed. That's the problem, but thank you, Cedric. It means a lot. I think all of this is nonsense, Fleur said, flipping her long blonde hair back in a snooty manner, causing Roger Davis, her date, to stare at her in awe. Madame Maxime says it's improper for a headmaster to say such horrible things about one of his current students. It makes Hogwarts look bad to us. Headmaster Dumbledore should be ashamed of himself, she added with a firm nod. Salazar managed to keep the grin off his face, and he could see Hermione doing her best to hold back a snort. Headmaster Karkaroff feels the same way, though he also thinks the whole thing is funny, Victor simply added. However, I myself am not pleased with Headmaster Dumbledore's lack of action against the attack on Hermione," he said with a deep scowl. "What attack?" Rita instantly asked. "I'm a Mulborn and I was attacked in Hogsmeade by Pansy Parkinson and her group of friends," Hermione explained. "I spent 2 days in the hospital wing recovering, and Professor Dumbledore did nothing but give them a stern talking to. For someone who claims to hold Mulborns in high regard, he sure didn't punish those Slytherin girls." Rita once again had her infamous grin on her face, but the sound of approaching footsteps interrupted the conversation. "Are you all ready?" Minerva asked, but then she smiled at Rita. "Miss Skeeter, it is lovely to have you here this evening." "Minerva McGonagall," Rita said with a raised eyebrow as she caught sight of Minerva's rather ugly arrangement of thistles she had placed on her hat. "It's a pleasure to be here." "Good evening, Professor Salazar," Hermione, Cho, and Cedric said together as they grinned at her. "And how is one of my favorite professors this evening?" Salazar asked with grin. "You look lovely as always." Minerva let off a rather girlish giggle and blushed. "Very well, Mr. Potter, thank you. Miss Skeeter, I should warn you that Albus," she said, rolling her eyes in a very unbecoming manner, "has caught word of you being here this evening, and he's not exactly happy." Rita's eyes shone with glee. "I'm sorry to hear that." "Well, I don't agree with him trying to keep you away from here in an attempt to silence you, or his attack on a mere boy of 14. Minerva said, motioning to Salazar. "He should be ashamed of himself." "Exactly what Madame Maxime said," Fleur repeated with a nod. "I agree fully," Rita said with a chuckle. "May I quote you, Minerva?" "Of course. He's already threatened me and my job. In fact, he tried to fire me because I disagree with how he is handling the situation with Mr. Potter, but he realized his mistake and changed his mind," she said with a smirk. "Really?" Rita, Cedric, and Cho asked with a surprised gasp. "I'll explain at another time," Minerva said, ushering them to the doors. "Right now it's time for the champion procession. Just take your seats at the table where all the heads of school are seated." They all nodded at her, and got ready to enter the Great Hall as the doors opened. Everyone gasped as they entered richly decorated Great Hall, though Salazar was unsure if it was because Rita was on his arm, or because of Hermione, who, if he was honest with himself, looked extremely beautiful in her flowing periwinkle robes. He heard whispers throughout the Great Hall, and saw many people pointing, but he just gave everyone a smile as they settled into their seats. Albus didn't look too happy as Rita sat across the round table from him, and he scowled at Salazar, who just politely nodded in his direction. All the heads of house and main subject professors sat at the next table over, and Salazar was happy to note that it would be easy to hold a conversation with them as well. Albus also kept shooting glares at Godric, who was sitting with Poppy at that same table, but Godric pointedly ignored him. The conversation was light and airy through most of dinner, but towards the end, Godric cleared his throat loudly, causing all conversation at both tables to come to a halt. "Mr. Dumbledore, I'm not sure if you remember me, but I'm Gordy Ruffin's father. May I ask you a question about your letter in the Daily Prophet?" Salazar bit his lip in an attempt to suppress a snort as Albus glared at Godric. "What is it, Mr. Ruffin?" Albus asked with strained politeness. "Well, something has been bothering me actually. If you knew what kind of boy Tom Riddle, or you know who was, then why didn't you stop him before he became so powerful?" Salazar noticed Rita's shark-like grin was back in a flash as her eyes gleamed brightly. Everyone else remained calm, but Severus sneered at Godric, while Sprout and Flitwick raised curious eyebrows in Albus's direction. "Godric, if I weren't worried about drawing unneeded attention to you, I'd hug you, my friend. There might be a bit of Slytherin in you after all," Salazar thought as he stifled a snicker. Albus, however, glared at him. "I am unsure what you are trying to imply, Mr. Ruffin." You obviously knew what kind of boy he was, so why didn't you stop him back then? The war could have been avoided, and lots of innocent people wouldn't have died, including Harry's parents. Godric said, taking a bite of his dessert. Would you say that the Wizarding War was your fault, Albus? Rita immediately asked with an innocent smile. Of course not. Albus exclaimed a bit too loudly, causing the other nearby tables to become quiet. Mr. Ruffin, you have obviously read what I wrote. Aren't you concerned about your son being friends with Harry? Not at all. Godric said with a dismissive wave of his hand. If Harry were indeed an aspiring Dark Lord as you put it, Nahum, Gordy's phoenix, would have warned him. I think he's ignoring Nahum's warnings. Albus said in a frank tone. Godric glared at him. Gordy would most certainly not. Godric cried. And I don't appreciate you making accusations against my son like that. He values Nahum's guidance, and would never jeopardize their bond. Isn't it true that your own Phoenix has studied Harry's soul and deemed it light? That was quite some time ago. Things have obviously changed with Harry. Albus said with a glare. So let's settle this then. Remus said. Call for Fawkes and have him study Harry's soul again. If it's dark, Fawkes would let us know, and if it's light, then it proves you wrong. Now is not an appropriate time. Albus said curtly. Ah, but Albus, Karkaroff said with an amused smile, wouldn't we all like to put this matter to rest? I know I would, especially since I haven't anything to worry about. Salazar said with a grin. Too bad Gordy's not here. He could call for Nahum to do it for Fawkes. He answers my calls too, Harry. Godric said with a wink. I don't think now is the best time. Albus repeated. Are you afraid of having egg on your face, Albus? Minerva asked with a raised eyebrow, causing Albus to glare at her. Rita's eyes bounced from person to person as she grinned, but Albus shook his head. Since I'm not bonded to Nahum, I'm afraid I will not be able to interpret his answer. He replied. Are you saying that I would lie? Godric asked in a dangerous tone. Not at all, I just... You dare to question my honor? Godric angrily continued, not giving Albus the chance to complete his reply. No, Mr. Ruffin, I don't. Albus said as he clenched his teeth together. Our guests would like the matter settled once and for all. Madam Maxime finished. Albus looked slightly taken aback by her statement, but he shook his head. Now is not a good time. Perhaps later. I know what it is, Rita said with a smile. You wish me not to hear the results. Isn't it, Albus? She asked in a false sweet voice that caused Salazar to chuckle. Albus took a deep breath. Not at all, Rita, but I do think dinner has come to an end. He said quickly as he stood up. I believe it's time for dancing. The great hall hushed as Albus stood up to make the announcement, but Cedric leaned past Rita in order to whisper to Salazar. I told you, Harry, something is not right. I think he's making it all up, he said. He is, Cedric. Salazar whispered back. It's as I said. He just doesn't like me. That is going into my next article, boys, Rita said with a chuckle. If you don't mind, that is. Not at all, Rita, Salazar said with a smile, as Cedric laughed. Would you care to dance? Certainly, she said with a bright smile. The rest of the evening was spent mostly dancing and having fun. Salazar stole Poppy from Godric for a few dances, and was able to also fight off Godric in order to dance with Minerva when Rita went to mingle in the crowd. He also danced with Hermione, while Crumb danced with Fleur, who then danced with Cedric. He was happy to see Ron grinning as he danced with Susan Bones, who looked to be in pain from having her feet stepped on, but it looked like they were having fun nonetheless. Neville and Hannah seemed to be enjoying themselves as they danced, and Blaise and Daphne looked to be having fun as well. Salazar talked to Hannah and Daphne a little, and he was happy to note that both of them had been assured by Neville and Blaze that he wasn't going to kill them all in their sleep one night, and Salazar smiled when Daphne said how sorry she was when she had heard about Hermione. By the time the evening came to a close, Salazar was tired, but he was happy. Rita had a lovely time both dancing and obtaining gossip, and he couldn't wait to read her next article. He knew Albus wasn't going to like it. However, as he entered the snake pit that night, he spied the golden egg sitting on the table and he knew he needed to get busy on trying to solve it because the second task was coming soon.